as he indicated, I have a graduate degree in history, and even though I left the profession, I taught at Penn for a while, and then I went and did other things. I live now at Cathedral Village, and we have an internal education program, so I'm very much involved in that. So this sort of grew out of that interest. Now, I didn't study Spies in the Atomic Age, but you learn certain research techniques when you're doing that kind of Ph.D. So that's what I tried to apply, and here we are. And I call it Spies in the Atomic Age. I used not quite as many spies as I thought, because Lawrence told me I have to hold the timing down for the talk. You're all familiar with Los Alamos, 1942 to 45, as the development of the first atomic bomb. And this is where the Rosenberg case comes from. A lot of people here close to my age or old enough to have grown up thinking, well, those Rosenbergs are really innocent and they're being railroaded by J. Edgar Hoover with the Red Scare and his allies, Senator McCarthy, and McCarthy's evil genius, Roy Cohn. History has sort of changed its opinion on some of those things. Not on McCarthy and Cohn, but on the Rosenbergs. And we also, talk about J. Robert Oppenheimer, with the movie and the book. I recommend that book very much. It tells you a lot more than the movie did. Only so much you can do. Trinity was the name of the explosion in July 1945, when they found that the atomic bomb would work. And this is a famous quotation from Oppenheimer. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture of the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another. So, there's this famous notion of Oppenheimer saying this, although he didn't have any regrets. He just thought about what might happen. He also tried to lobby President Truman not to pursue this Cold War on atomic warfare. Truman sort of didn't say it to his face, but sort of dismissed him as a pussyfooting academic. And that the CIA, I don't know if it was called the CIA in the late 40s, predicted that the Russians wouldn't have a bomb for a number of years. And then the American program started in 43. The Russian program started in 43. Curiously, the director was Lavrentiy Beria, if you know the name, as the head of, what was it called then? I guess the NKVD, a murderous individual, but he was also involved in this. And then the Soviets exploded their bomb in 1949. And the Americans went crazy. The Russians couldn't possibly have done this on their own. They were convinced that, didn't know what to think. And there's the, just curious, I didn't know what an atomic bomb looked like. There you are. So I got started on this with memories of the Rosenberg case. Any people here grow up with that in their atmosphere? It was in the early 50s, and they were executed. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed in 1953. I don't know if there are any other cases of execution for atomic spying. And we'll talk about what people have discovered since the 50s. But it was almost a family affair. David Greenglass is brother-in-law, Harry Gold, somehow connected, Morton Sobel. These are the names that come out in the Rosenberg case. That's a picture of Joyce and Ethel Rosenberg. And that's what's the date on that? Can't see. June 20th, 1953. Well, demand justice for the Rosenbergs. This was a not worldwide, but US and European-wide campaign. First to say they were innocent, and secondly to prevent their execution. The opposition to execution was partly opposition to anything American, but also against the death penalty. Although there were plenty of European intellectuals, Jean-Paul Sartre, for example, who weren't so upset because they were much more kindly disposed to the Russians. Not that he was really concerned about the case of the Rosenbergs. Just as an aside, I was in a French class, and I recently had to do a paper on Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus. They really had been close friends, and all of a sudden they split, and a lot of it had to do over what's the human action, what should, quote, revolution consist of. Camus being a convinced pacifist till the end of his life. Here are some of the other characters. Harry Gold and David Greenglass. Greenglass was a low-level engineer, and Gold was a courier, contact between them and the Soviet agent. Morton Sobel, forgotten how he got involved, but he flew to Mexico, and then the US arranged to have him arrested there and extradited. So at Los Alamos, there are probably 4 spies, maybe more, but these are what we know of. The most consequential one is that one on the upper left, Klaus Fuchs. And he is actually the spy of the century. We'll say some more about that in a second. Ted Hall, next, looks like a teenager. He was probably not much more than that. He hadn't finished his, I don't think he had finished college yet. Then David Greenglass, as I mentioned, and Oscar Seaborer, I can get very little information about him, and it was only revealed a few years ago. Klaus Fuchs was a physicist, a very accomplished physicist, who was seconded from the British atomic project to the United States, came to Los Alamos. And the Americans accepted the fact that he had been vetted by the British, and I guess the British saw that he had been in the Communist Party in Germany, but they thought that that was a lie manufactured by the Nazis when he fled from Great Britain. It's interesting, you contrast him with the Rosenbergs. He was sentenced to 14 years, spent 9 years in jail, and then released, and went to East Germany, became a professor. So the contrast in their fates is interesting, horrible. As I said, David Greenglass, the brother of Ethel Rosenberg, Ted Hall, the youthful spy, and Oscar Seaborer, who had defected to the Soviet Union. He had died in 2015 somehow. We'll figure out how they learned who they were in 2019. The most important source for figuring out who spies were something called the Venona transcripts. Venona was the US code-breaking activity. And what ordinarily, when you send coded messages, the Russians were using what's called a one-time pad. You use it, and you can never redo it. Somehow, the Americans got a hold of partial parts of the same path. And they worked for years trying to interpret what they said. And the Americans, especially J. Edgar Hoover, were reluctant to tell anybody what they had. And in fact, when they had these trials, he did not admit that they had some evidence. The whole story of the Venona trials, Venona transcripts is weird, but it's still alive. People still talk about this stuff. And then you can ask, who were these people? Especially the most celebrated, I'd say the most celebrated trial of the 20th century in the United States, certainly. You have this judge, Irving Kaufman. Rosenberg and Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were Jewish. Kaufman was Jewish and received a lot of pressure, especially from Roy Cohn, who was the counsel for McCarthy. Kaufman said, and I'll tell you, I'll mention why I say that in a minute. Kaufman says, I consider your crime worse than murder. Plain, deliberate, contemplated murder is dwarfed in magnitude by comparison with the crime you have committed. But in your case, I believe your product in putting into the hands of the Russians the A-bomb years before our best scientists predicted Russia would perfect the bomb has already caused, in my opinion, communist aggression in Korea, with the resultant casualties exceeding 50,000. And who knows, but that millions more of innocent people may pay the price of your treason. Indeed, by your betrayal, you undoubtedly have ordered the course of history to the disadvantage of our country. Now, this is really an overblown analysis of what they did. It also, the Americans predict the Russians couldn't do anything. It's also a kind of condescension that the Russians couldn't possibly do the kind of research that the Americans did. You know, those ignorant Eastern Europeans, it just didn't work. So in the 50s, early 50s, this becomes food for the Red Scare. The FBI, J. Edgar Hoover helped that trial of the Rosenbergs by orchestrating leaks. You know, he never appeared, he never gave public testimony, but he clearly was behind it. By the way, we think that Julius Rosenberg was a kind of, I wouldn't say a high-level spy. He was a spy. He knew some stuff. There's a lot of suspicion. His wife, we don't know. She probably knew what he did, but there's no evidence that she was actively involved in espionage. And the theory is that they put her on trial to blackmail him into naming names. Other accused spies, and these are people that appeared on Senator McCarthy's list. I have in my hand a list of whatever, 180, 200 known spies. And of course, we as young people rejected all that. Couldn't be possible. What's interesting, there are two very important people. Harry Dexter White, who is the architect of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, probably passed on confidential information. He's not a spy in the same sense that Klaus Fuchs was, who sent on technical material. But my impression is, in looking for world peace and the fact that the Soviet Union in the 30s was our ally, he did pass on some stuff. And one historian says, a combination of naivete, superficiality, and supreme confidence in his own judgment explains the course of action White took. There's no question of treachery in the accepted sense of betraying one country's secrets to an enemy. But there can be no doubt that in passing classified information to the Soviets, White knew he was betraying his trust, even if he did not thereby think he was betraying his country. So he's one of the most, it took a while for this to come out. It just, I was flabbergasted learning this, even though I learned it after a lot of other people. The other infamous, quote, spy, again, not spy in the same sense as the people at Los Alamos, but people who passed on confidential information. Alger Hiss, you may be familiar with the name. And he was convicted of perjury because he had the statute of limitations on whatever he did had expired, but he was convicted of lying to Congress. Now, Alger Hiss is one of the architects of the United Nations. So we have some really high-level people who are sympathetic, I think, to world peace, and they chose to act on that by doing stuff that is not really acceptable in the national eyes. In 1949, after the Soviet exploded an atomic bomb, Senator McCarthy, aided by Roy Cohn and J. Edgar Hoover and others, just went crazy. Congress was totally cowed for a while, for several years. This was stuff that just occupied people's attention for a while. This is also a time, and if you've seen the Oppenheimer movie or read the book, his experience was over the development of the H-bomb. Edward Teller was a leading scientist who was at Los Alamos, but he demanded research into developing what he called the super, which is what the hydrogen bomb is, many times more powerful than the atomic bomb. And he went on to lead a project where the US developed an H-bomb in 1952, and the Soviet Union had their own scientists, surprisingly, did it in 1955. The story that I have read is that the reports that came from Los Alamos went almost directly to Stalin or Beria, and that he didn't turn them over immediately to their scientists, but used them to prod them along, suggesting that they not go into some blind alleys. Remember, there were a lot of countries who were developing atomic stuff. The British were, the Japanese were, we were afraid that the Germans were, but the Germans, by excluding Jewish physics, kept themselves out of the game. Here's Joseph McCarthy. As you see, he's showing a chart of Communist Party organization in the US. Quote, here's McCarthy with Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn is one of the most vicious people I've ever read about. He continues his work after the McCarthy Committee. He was in New York as a wire puller. If you've seen the play or the movie Angels in America, you see Roy Cohn as vicious toward the very end. He was involved with Hoover in the early 50s. In addition to the Red Scare, they have what they call the Lavender Scare, attacks on homosexuals, attempt to drive them out of the government positions and to arrest them if they could find them in the act. So we have all these characters, McCarthy, Roy Cohn, here's Teller, who gets involved in the case of the security hearing for J. Robert Oppenheimer. Now, J. Robert Oppenheimer was a brilliant physicist, perhaps not, from what I've read, perhaps not on the level of those who got a Nobel Prize, other people who were at Los Alamos, like Hans Bethe, for example, or John von Neumann. But he was a fabulous teacher and someone who knew how to concentrate what other people had found and to present it. I mean, his students were legion in really understanding stuff from atomic physics. Well, there was a security hearing at the time of the Red Scare in the early 50s, and Edward Teller translated Oppenheimer's opposition to the H-bomb to labeling him a security threat. Here's a quote from Teller. "In a great number of cases, I have seen Dr. Oppenheimer act in a way which for me was exceedingly hard to understand. I thoroughly disagreed with him in numerous issues, and his actions frankly appeared to me confused and complicated. In this very limited sense, I would like to express a feeling that I would personally feel more secure if public matters would rest in other hands." He's not saying he's hinting that Oppenheimer is indiscreet. He can't say it. And this was at a hearing on Oppenheimer's security clearance in 1954. And eventually, they removed his security clearance, and they really kind of ended his career as a major physicist on the American scene, although he lived another 7 or 8 years, well, until 67. But these are all images of J. Robert Oppenheimer, and I encourage you to read about him. And here's Teller, who's hanging around with the Reagan. It became, there was no bomb too big for him. He was a spokesman for the Strategic Defense Initiative. And I remember he had this, even as a non-physicist, it would seem to be a cockamamie idea. In order to prevent the world from being hit by meteors, we need to build some huge atomic engines that can move the Earth out of its orbit. That was very strange. Well, they're the US. We saw these people. And as I say, a lot of them come from Eastern European immigrant families, Jewish families. And you compare that to these atomic spies in Great Britain, and they're all from elite universities. They went to elite schools. So there's still a question of what motivates those people. Alan Nunn May, he's part of what we'll call the tube alloys team. That was the British name for the development of atomic weapons. He was a physicist at Cambridge, then he went with the English team to Quebec, and from what we can tell, he was afraid of a German dirty bomb, meaning an atomic bomb. He contacted the Soviets. He didn't want any money for what he did. He felt he was doing right in the world. He denied treason and believed he had acted rightly in order to secure victory over Germany. And he was eventually implicated by a defector, sentenced to 10 years, and released in 1952. Here's a high-level scientist, not on the level of Klaus Fuchs, but a high-level scientist gets 10 years. Here are some of the people in the British side. The guy on the left is someone named George Blake, who defected early. Next to him is Alan Nunn May, then Klaus Fuchs, and finally John Bassel. We'll mention Bassel in a minute because he's a little different from a lot of the other spies, but they all are involved in British atomic research. After Los Alamos has its great victory, quote, with the development of the atomic bomb, the British should go home and continue with their work. After all, the British today are one of the world's atomic powers. And of course, the French also developed stuff. And as we've seen, with a certain amount of help, other countries can develop atomic stuff. So who are these atomic spies in Great Britain? As I mentioned, Klaus Fuchs, who had been a refugee from Germany in the 1930s. He confessed in 1949, and they really went at him, and he finally confessed, and he spent 9 years in jail and then went back to East Germany. He was accepted as a hero. Here's one we don't hear about too much, Melita Norwood. She was a secretary in Tube Alloys. And she continued into the 1970s to send on information. It's not clear to me just how basic that information was, but when she was exposed in the 1990s, when she was apparently quite elderly, she cheerfully admitted what she had done and said she would do it again. There's this notion that the Soviet Union should be kept on a par with the Western powers in order to assure world peace. That's one way of putting it. Another, there's just this lot of sympathy for what the Soviets were doing. From what I can see, is a lot of blindness about what the Soviets were doing, but it was. Here's John Cairncross, who was a private secretary to someone involved in Tube Alloys. And what he did was give the Russians a list of American atomic scientists. And he confessed in 1960, but we didn't know about that till 1990. The British just kept it quiet. It was sort of to me, it's sort of an old boys' school secret. You know, our people don't do things like that, and if they did, we don't want to admit it. Here we're going to go back to Cairncross. We used to talk about the Cambridge three high-level Cambridge-educated people, not necessarily scientists. And then there were Cambridge 4. We found another one. And in the 1950s and 90s, Cambridge 5. So there we are, 3, 4, 5 infinity. I don't know how many there were. Kim Philby was the most successful mole in the British Secret Service who's ever existed. He was recruited as a spy in 1934. When you read about him, it's difficult to find his motivation. There must be something that made him think the Soviet Union was a great place. He was investigated after the Americans said they had evidence that he's suspicious. So he was not able to continue what he did in 1955. But he continued to rise in MI5 to the point where he might have become director of the British counterintelligence network. It was very close to that. First he was posted to Washington as I don't remember the title in the Washington Embassy of the Soviet Union, but he was there and he knew a lot of stuff. An example of the kind of information he gave. The CIA, I don't remember when it took that title, probably in the late 1940s, I think, had an idea that they were going to feed Eastern European protest movements by sending in supplies and money and stuff. And the first plot was against Albania. Somehow the British found that all of the people they sent to Albania were arrested almost as soon as they got there. As Kim Philby says, the agents we sent into Albania were armed men intent on murder, sabotage, and assassination. They knew the risks they were running. I was serving the interests of the Soviet Union, and those interests required that these men be defeated. To the extent that I helped defeat them, even if it caused their deaths, I have no regrets. So that's one of the examples of what he did to sabotage Western intelligence attempts. And in this case, he has a point. You know, there was this idea, this maximal attempt in the CIA that all we have to do is send in some dissidents and they will get the people to rise. It's that same kind of thinking that led to the collapse of the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. But Here he is. You can test your Russian. It says Kim Philby, 1912, 1988, USSR postage, 1990. So he was treated after he defected in 1963 as a really important person for the Soviet Union. Who are some of the other Cambridge people? Guy Burgess, what says here, he disappeared in 51, but he sort of defected to the Soviet Union. He had been brought in on Philby's recommendation. Burgess remained unrepentant to the end of his life. He always rejected the idea that he had committed treason. Donald MacLean, another very high-ranking person in the British anti-Soviet network, was recruited in 34. He defected in 51. His defection, MacLean and Burgess probably defected because Philby found out there were suspicions and they were about to be arrested. So this intertwining of stuff. MacLean was the main source of information about U.S. thermonuclear policy. Now here we're getting into a different kind of spying in terms of, it doesn't give you any scientific secrets, but it's talking about personnel and where the Americans are going. I mean, there's no question the Americans would have liked to do that in the Soviet Union, but we're not successful. The most amazing case is, to me, Anthony Blunt, art historian. He was a curator of the art collection of Windsor Castle. He passed information about transcripts of Ultra. Now, Ultra was the name for the British deciphering unit. They had a machine, they captured a machine. The Poles brought with them a machine that was used for deciphering stuff. And they were very successful at that with the using the Ultra. Some of you may have known about Bletchley Park, which is the Center for British Counterintelligence, and Alan Turing, who was, we still have him, if you know anything about the Turing numbers and all kinds of Alan. He was in charge of a lot of what went on at Bletchley Park. What's interesting about Blunt confessed in 1964, and the British offered him immunity from prosecution if he were to confess. And it was only when Margaret Thatcher became prime minister, she was absolutely appalled that this guy was still hanging around, and it was revealed that he lost his post as the art historian and the curator of art. It's a very major collection of art, by the way. Well, here's John Cairncross, another one. He got immunity from prosecution. Those are what I call the Cambridge Five. They're all from elite public schools, elite university. One historian has concluded that MacLean seemed happy in his Russian exile, while Burgess and Philby drank themselves to death. Philby, by the way, was apparently amazingly charming. He had so many friends, both in the British elite circles and in the United States when he met with people from the State Department and particularly from the CIA. They just loved him. He just had that ability to come across to people and to avoid detection for so long. As I say, after he was dismissed from the Secret Service, he became a journalist, which he had been in the 1930s. And eventually people caught up with him in Beirut in the early 60s, and then he fled to the Soviet Union. There he is. Another notorious case was Roger Hollis. He was head of MI5 for 10 years. And Peter Wright, who had been an assistant director of MI5, was convinced that Roger Hollis, head of MI5, was a Soviet agent. It's never been proved that that was true. We know that there was somebody there. When he wrote this book, Spycatcher, which is a real cloak and dagger book, it's fun to read, the British government brought a lawsuit against this publication, which it lost. The Sunday Telegraph was sued to prevent its publication. And in the US, it became the best-selling hardback of 1987. It sold 400,000 copies. The House of Lords, which at that time functioned as the Supreme Court of Great Britain, said it was okay to publish extracts because any damage to national security had already been done. It was published in the US, in Australia, even in Scotland. And an injunction against the Sunday Times for serializing the American edition was dropped. Charges were dropped last week when a high court judge ruled that it made the law an ass to uphold it when the book was available, readily available. Peter Wright became a millionaire on the basis of the sales of that book. It's really attention-grabbing when you read through it. Now, who is John Vassell? That's a curious case of a different kind of counter-espionage, if you will. He was probably a homosexual, which was illegal at the time in the 50s and 40s in Great Britain. And the notion is the Soviets used, I don't remember if it was a man or a woman, to have sex with him, which they then, probably a man, filmed and used that as blackmail against Vassell. He was photographed at a party in Moscow in 1954, and he transmitted information on radar and naval commitment. Remember that during the Second World War, most scientists were not concerned with atomic physics. They were concerned with radar. That was really considered crucial at the time. Why it was so important still in the 1950s, I can't tell you. But he was sentenced to 18 years, served 10 years. And he's typical of what I think is a new generation of spies. They were not so ideologically motivated as earlier spies. I mean, Philby and Blake and Burgess, McLean. And in the US, Rosenberg, Greenglass, Gold, they are ideologically motivated. We may find that ideology to be a little strange, but they were so motivated. And in the case of Vassell, he was blackmailed and he got a lot of money. That's what's different. These other people, in the main, weren't in it for the money. They were in it for some intellectual satisfaction or whatever. I should say, before I go back to that Ted Hall, the guy who looks like a teenager, fled to Great Britain and became a leading biochemist. They knew about his background, but he had left behind what he had done. But in 1971, 90 Soviets were deported from Great Britain on the charges of spying. This was the result of information from a defector. So there were lots of them there, continued there. And there's a continuity of spying using honey traps. That is, catching someone in a sexually compromising situation that can then be used as blackmail. So in 2025, this is just recently, 3 Bulgarians active in a British seaside resort were convicted for enticing a British official into what we're calling a honey trap. Here they are. Well, finally, why do you become a spy? That's really, you don't read too much about that. It's very difficult to figure out. But you take Klaus Fuchs, a German who fled from Nazi Germany, who had been a communist and retained a certain loyalty. Kim Philby, something was going on in Cambridge in the 1930s. Julius Rosenberg is part of this group of a lot of left-wing Eastern European Jews who became involved. There are a number of them. Here's Ted Hall, at least he made a comment that he felt strongly that an American monopoly on nuclear weapons was dangerous and should be avoided. And probably a lot of people shared that opinion, but they didn't pass on the secrets. David Greenglass implicated his sister, Ethel Rosenberg, probably to protect his wife. He described his own testimony as, quote, an act of contrition for the wrong I had done my country, my family, and myself. I don't know, he was caught, so I'm not sure about that contrition. Guy Burgess, the one who had defected to the Soviet Union, remained unrepentant to the end of his life, and he never admitted that what he had done was treason. Anthony Blunt is interesting. This is the art historian who was confessed and then given compromise. What I did not realize is that I was so politically naive that I was not justified in committing myself to any political action of this kind. The atmosphere in Cambridge was so intense. The enthusiasm for any anti-fascist activity was so great that I made the biggest mistake of my life. And this is, I think this has some explanation about what happened at Cambridge. There's this tremendous feeling of anti-fascist activity, and once you commit giving the secrets, you're caught. You can't stop doing it in a way. Blunt said in his public confession that it was Burgess who converted him to the Soviet cause after they both had left Cambridge. They would both have been members of something called the Cambridge Apostles. And Burgess could have recruited Blunt, or vice versa, either at Cambridge or later when they worked for British intelligence. And Blunt admitted that he had been recruiting spies. And in Britain, the MI5 and MI6 also recruited students. You know, you have professors who act as spotters for possible intelligence operatives. Well, I'm going to end there. These are just a few books that you can look at. They're, the book's still coming out. Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin, the biography of American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer. Trinity, Treachery and Pursuit of the Most Dangerous Spy in History. I mentioned Spycatcher. I want to mention this last book. Ronald Radosh and Joyce Milton wrote a book called The Rosenberg, I think it's Rosenberg File, and that files. Radosh is the first American historian to make the claim that Julius Rosenberg was a spy. Radosh, I actually just the other day I finished the book I didn't know about, his memoir called Commies. He was very much involved in the American Communist Party from the time he was a baby, red diaper baby, if you will. He was, if you read this book, you see he's involved in all the left-wing activities of the 50s and 60s. You name an organization, he was involved, whether it was SDS, Students for Democratic Society, or whether it was the Socialist Labor Party. I think that was the title. That was the Trotskyist Party, the American Communist Party. Involved in all of these. And he wrote this book, which of course he was then excluded by many of his left-wing colleagues. And he said he was amazed, and finally he's trying to figure out is that the left needed a martyr. The left didn't have a martyr. And privately, some people told him, yeah, sounds like you're correct. But they would never admit that. And he was eventually, as I say, kicked out of all his circles, although he still continued to write left-wing articles, but it was not the same as before. And if you were familiar with some of the people from the 50s, his book, Commies, is really a very interesting memoir. Well, I'm going to stop here.